Imagine replacing your mailbox over and over, only to see it smashed again by the same patrol Carson rancher. Finally said no more and built a box so tough it turned the fight into a battle that reached the courtroom. The sound came first. A sharp, hollow crack that carried across the open stretch of land like a gunshot. Curtis Delaney didn't need to look up from the workbench in his barntow. No, what had just happened, he had heard that sound too many times before the sickening crunch of his mailbox meeting another bumper. He dropped his wrench, stepped outside, and sure, in all fear, it was his brand new mailbox. Barely 2 weeks old, lay folded in half at the edge of his ranch driveway. FM 89, just outside Abilene, Texas, the metal post. Bent at a crooked Anglite's door, hanging open like a broken jaw, the white SUV from the HOA patrol slowed briefly then carried on down the road as if nothing had happened. Curtis rubbed his temples. 52 years old, he had worked hard to build a life here. His ranch wasn't large by Texas standards, but it was his pride-fenced pasture land, a modest farmhouse, and a shop where he welded and fixed equipment. But lately it seemed like no matter how much he poured into the land, someone was set on making sure his peace never lasted. Had replaced that mailbox 4 times in less than 6 months. Each one cost money. One took time to install, and each one ended up flattened under the tires of those so-called cops that patrolled the neighborhood. Curtis muttered under his breath, "That's it. I'm Donnie." Crossed the yard toward the road boots, kicking up dust. A neighbor, Janice Hollowbrook, walking her dog across the street, and stopped when she saw the wreck. Again she called, shaking her head. Curtis nodded, hands on his hips. "5th time, Janice, 5th damn time." Janice pulled her hat lower against the sun. They must be doing it on purpose. Anybody hits the same mailbox over and over unless they're blind. Curtis exhaled hard. Blind or just don't. Caray's frustration wasn't just about the mailbox, it was the way he felt dismissed whenever he raised it at HOA meetings. Some neighbors looked at him like he was the problem, as if the cost and hassle were his to burst, me because he lived on the far end of the patrol route. The first time at Hoppanetti had told himself it was just bad luck. By the third, he suspected something. Moreno, standing in front of the mangled post again. He felt the anger boiling over. That night at the dinner table, his wife Renee tried to calm him. "Curtis, maybe you should just put the mailbox closer to the house. Way they can't hit it." He shook his head. "That's not the point. They'll find a way to mess with it no matter where I tend. I'll be damned if I let them push me around." His son Caleb leaned forward. "You think they're targeting you?" Curtis paused. He wasn't sure if it was deliberate harassment or reckless driving, but deep down he knew it didn't matter. What mattered was that it kept happening, and the people responsible didn't care. "They don't respect me," he said finally, "and I'm tired of paying for their mistakes." The next morning, Curtis stood at the edge of his property with a tape measure in hand, staring at the ruins of the mailbox. Cars passed by, some slowing to glance at the damage. He could almost hear the whispers already. "He's gonna complain again. Why doesn't he just drop it?" Curtis never lets anything go, but letting it go wasn't in his nature. He had grown up in Wichita Falls, son of a steelworker, and had spent years in the oil fields before buying this ranch. He knew what it meant to fight for what you owned. He knew what it meant to stand firm even when people wanted you to bend. And as he stood there under the scorching Texas sun sweet rolling down his neck, Curtis made a decision that would set the entire neighborhood talking. Was done playing nice, but what Curtis didn't realize yet was that his next move wouldn't just stop the mailbox attacks. It would spark a battle that pulled the entire community into its crossfire. Curtis didn't just imagine the pattern, he lived it. He could map out the destruction like a time lineage. Busted mailbox, a marker of his frustration. The first one had gone down on a Friday evening in late February, just as the last bite of winter clung to North Texas. Been out feeding his cattle when he heard the thud and saw a patrol vehicle drive away, leaving the post split like kindling. He replaced it the next morning, chalking it up to bad luck of everybody makes mistakes on those narrow roads, he told himself. The shoulder was soft, the turn sometimes sharp, no need to stir up trouble. But 2 weeks later, another patrol SUV came around, the bend clipped it, and left it bent in. Half again, Curtis remembered staring at the mess in disbelief. A second accident in as many weeks, it didn't sit right by the third time. Disbelief turned into irritation. He called the HOA office and asked to speak with whoever handled security. Young receptionist told him she'd pass along the complaint. Days went by, nobody called back, nobody apologized when he brought it up at the next HOA meeting. The chairman, Gregory Winslow, back in his chair and smirked. "Curtis, those roads are tight," Winslow said, his voice carrying that air of practiced authority. "It happens, mailboxes get hit all the time." Curtis clenched his jaw. 5 in less than half a year. "You think that's normal?" A few neighbors shuffled uncomfortably in their seats. Winslow shrugged. "It's part of living out Haramib. Move the post back a few feet. Give the drivers more space." The meeting moved on. Curtis felt the sting of being brushed off, but he didn't let it show, not until he got home, slammed his truck door, and muttered to Renee, "They don't give a damn. Not a single damn." Renee tried to steady him, telling him not to waste his energy on them, but Curtis couldn't. It wasn't just about a box at the end of his drive. It was the principle. It was about respect. Neger started noticing too. One evening at the grocery store in Abilene, an older man named Sherman Hay stopped Curtis in the aisle. "Hey, I've seen your mailbox keep getting hit. You sure they're not doing that to mess with you?" Curtis sighed. "I've thought about it, but if I say that out loud, I sound paranoid." Sherman lowered his voice. "In that paranoid? If it's true, you challenged the HOA about that fence rule last year, didn't you folks?" Don't forget that stuck with Curtis. He had gone head-to-head with Winslow before over whether ranchers should be allowed higher fencing along the back pasture. He won that fight. Winslow hadn't looked him in the eye since. So was this about fences, about Curtis standing his grounder. Was it just lousy drivers who couldn't keep their SUVs between the lines? The pattern suggested otherwise each time a new mailbox went up. It didn't last long. Neighbors' boxes stood untouched, rusted and crooked from years of weather, but Curtis's gleamed new until another patrol car turned it into scrappy. The time the fifth one went down, Curtis didn't just see a string of excitancy, saw a message. Whether it was deliberate harassment or careless repetition, it sent the same signal: you can't win. At night, he would sit on the porch with Renee, both of them staring at the road. Curtis would mutter, "They think I'll give up. They think I'll stop putting it back." Renee would place her hand over his, "And will you?" Curtis shook his head. "Not a chance." He kept replaying, dismissive tone in Winslow's voice. At that meeting, how quickly everyone moved on, as though his problem wasn't real. Thought stung more than the wrecked boxes. The feeling of being silenced, minimized, and left to handle it alone. And slowly, an idea began to form. It wasn't enough to keep replacing what they destroyed. If they wanted to treat his property like it didn't matter, then he'd make sure it mattered more than anything else. In that road, he began sketching designs in his shop late at night, laying out steel beams, bolts, and concrete base as if they wanted to keep hitting his mailbox. Fine. But this time the mailbox would hit back. Bet before Curtis could put his plan into action, one more meeting with Winslow and the HOA would push him from frustrated to furious. And that's when the real fight began. The community center smelled faintly of old carpet and burnt coffee. Curtis took a seat near the back, arms folded tight across his chest. He wasn't here for small talk. He wasn't here for cookies or the chit-chat about lawn fertilizer. Was here for one thing: to make them listen. At the front, under fluorescent lights, sat the HOA board. 5 people behind a long folding table. In the middle was Gregory Winslow's silver hair combed back, a tailored sport coat stretched across his shoulders like he was running a Fortune 500 companion instead of a neighborhood association in West Texas. Gregory tapped the microphone. "Light, folks. Let's get started. We'll go over landscaping updates, then neighborhood patrol reports him, then take any comments." Curtis could feel his jaw tightening. He'd heard it all before. The polished, routineth way Gregory managed to sound polite while dismissing anything that mattered to people who weren't in his circle. The floor opened, Curtis stood. "Yeah, I've got something," his voice carried across the room low. But steady heads turned, Gregory's smile thinned. "Go ahead, Mr. Delaney." Curtis walked a few steps closer. "That's the 5th mailbox. This yearsome story. Every time patrol car runs it over, nothing gets done. I'm not asking for sympathy, I'm asking why the people we pay to protect our neighborhood keep destroying my property." Murmur ran through the crowd. Some neighbors avoided his eyes, staring at their phones or shuffling papers. Others leaned forward, curious. Gregory cleared his throat. "Curtis, accidents happened. Patrols are doing their best, those roads." Curtis cut him off. "Don't say it's the roads. Me neighbors' mailboxes have been standing for years, rusted, crooked, beat up by the weather, but they're still theremin gets flattened like clockwork." One of the board members, Pamela Griggs, tried to jump in. "Maybe the placement." "No," Curtis snapped. "It's not placement, it's not chance. This is happening too often to be coincidence either. They're careless, or they're aiming for it, and either way, I'm paying for it." Gregory leaned back, folding his hands like a patient teacher. "Curtis, you've got to understand, these patrols keep crime down. Their volunteers, their neighbors' volunteers, don't drive SUVs with flashing lights. Curtis, Stead volunteers don't cost me 5 mailboxes in 6 months." The room grew tense. A man in the second row whispered something to his wife. She shook her head quickly. Curtis noticed he always noticed. Gregory finally raised his voice, just enough to reassert control. "Look, we can't reimburse every resident for every accident. We did that. The HOA would be broke in a month. Maybe, like I said before, you should move your mailbox back a few feet. That would solve your problem." The words hung in the air. Solve your problem, like Curtis was the one in the wrong. Curtis took a deep breath. Wasn't a man who lost his temper easily, but he felt his voice shake as he sat. "That box is on my land. It's not in the road. It's not sticking out. It's where it belongs. You all know it." Silence, sir, for a moment. The room was still. Then Sherman Hayes, the neighbor from the grocery store, spoke up. "Gregory, he's right. I've lived on this road 30 years. I've never seen anything like this. Somebody's mailbox keeps getting hit over and over. That ain't normal." All eyes turned back to the board. Pamela fiddled with her papers. Gregory shifted in his chair. Finally, Gregory forced a smile wheel. "Make a note of your concern, Curtis. That's all we can do right now." Curtis felt the heat rise in his chest. A note after months of damage, after money waste, after being ignored. All they could do was write a note. He turned and left without another word. Scrape of his boots echoed down the hall as neighbors whispered in his wake. Outside in the parking lot, Sherman caught up to him. "You gave it to him straight in there. Don't let him make you the problems. Protecting them, not you." Curtis nodded, slowly staring at the horizon. "I'll protect myself." But Curtis wasn't just talking about words anymore. He was already picturing steel concrete and a mailbox that wouldn't bow to anyone. By the following week, whispers had spread through the community faster than a prairie fire in August. Curtis didn't have to imagine what people were saying. He could hear it every time he walked into the feed store in Buffalo Gap, or stopped for gas at the station off Highway 83. They say he went off on Winslow at the meeting. "Wouldn't surprise me." Curtis always did have a temper. "Maybe you should just let it go. It's a mailbox, not the Alamo." Curtis kept his head down, but he heard every word. He wasn't a man to cause scenes in public, but the talk stung. It painted him as the troublemaker, not the one being wronged. On a Saturday afternoon, he was in his barn sorting tools when his neighbor, Redith Rowland, walked up the drive. Edith was sharp-tongued, late 60. Sand never missed a chance to put her nose in other people's business. "You really gave Greg a mouthful the other night," said, leaning on the doorframe. Curtis didn't look up. "I spoke my piece," Edith chuckled. "Well, now folks are saying you're picking fights just to stir the pot. Mailbox ain't worth losing friends over." Curtis wiped sweat from his forehead and finally met her eyes. "It's not about the mailbox. It's about respect. If it was your fancier, your front porch Getting smashed, you wouldn't let it go either. Edith frowned, chewing on his words for a moment before muttering maybe so, then she walked away without another word. Later that evening, Curtis sat on the porch with Renee, listening to the cicadas. Could see the weight on his shoulders. "You're not sleeping," she said softly. "I keep running it through my head." Admitted, what if? Sherman's right. What if this is their way of getting back at Meffer, pushing back on them before every time I've stood up to that board? Winslow acts like I'm some kind of nuisance, like I don't belong here. Renee squeezed his hand. "You do belong, Herodon. Let them make you think otherwise." But the pressure didn't stop. The very next day, Curtis drove into town and overheard two men near the counter at the hardware store. Delaney's mailbox again, said, "Yeah, I heard he's blaming the patrol figures, always looking for a fight." Curtis tightened his grip on the bag of nails in his hand, then set it down and walked out before he said something he'd regret. Back at home, his son Caleb was waiting by the shop. "Dad, people at school are saying you're planning to sue the Chotat." True. Curtis raised an eyebrow. "Suing costs money we don't have." "No, I'm not swingthin'. What are you gonna do?" Caleb pressed. Curtis didn't answer right away. He ran a hand across the cold steel beams he had set aside in the shop. Pieces of an idea were already in motion. "Gonna build something?" He finally said. "Something they can't break." Caleb grinned, half joking, like a tank. Curtis smiled faintly. "Close enough." That night, Renee voiced her worry. "What if this just makes things worse? People are already talking." Curtis shook his head. "They're already against me." Renee could do nothing, and they'd still find a reason. "At least this way, I'll be on my own term." Sort of his plan must have spread somehow, because within days, neighbors started stopping by. Curious, Sherman dropped in again and looked at the steel laid out in Curtis's shop. "You're serious about this?" Sherman said. "Dead serious." Curtis replied. "Won't they just say you're setting a trap?" Curtis gave a humorless laugh. "Let them. I'm setting a boundary, Sherman. There's a difference." The tension was no longer quiet. People were taking sides. Some admired his stubbornness, while others whispered that he was dangerous. HOA board did nothing to calm the waters. If anything, Gregory's dismissive attitude fanned the flames. Curtis could feel the community turning into a battlefield of rumors. Each comment another reminder that he stood alone. But that loneliness only hardened his resolve. But whispers and rumors were just the beginning. Soon, Curtis would move from talk to action, and the sound of welding would echo louder than gossip ever could. Be late spring. The decision had settled in Curtis's chest like a weight he couldn't put down. Was done waiting for the HOA to act. He was done replacing mailboxes. Like you fool, if nobody else was going to protect his property, then he'd protect it himself. Shop behind his farmhouse became his war room. Each night after dinner, he'd pull on his gloves, flip down his welding mask, and set the sparks flying. The sound carried across the pasture, sharp and deliberate, like hammers striking steel in a blacksmith's forge. Curtis had always been handy. Years of working oil rigs and repairing ranch equipment made sure of that. But this project was different. This wasn't maintenance. This was armor. On Saturday, his son Caleb wandered in, holding a soda can. Eyes wide as he watched the work. "Dad, what exactly are you building?" he asked, raising his voice over the grinder's buzz. Curtis stopped, lifted the mask, and wiped sweat from his brow. "A mailbox they'll never forget." Caleb laughed nervously. "You're serious?" Curtis motioned to the steel plate on the workbench stoves. This looked like a joke beneath the cedar planks he had stacked in the corner. Curtis was welding together a steel skeleton. Frame would be anchored 3 feet deep in concrete, reinforced with rebar from the outside. Yacht would look like any ordinary wooden postbox, hand stained to blend in with the neighborhood. But inside, it would be a fortress. Renee walked in just then, drying her hands on a towel. "Curtis, you really think this is the answer?" He didn't hesitate. "I know it." Ish crossed her arms. "And what if someone gets hurt?" Curtis set the torch down. "They've been hurting me, Renee. Every time they drive through that box, they're telling me my property doesn't matter. If they hit this one, they'll finally feel what I've been feeling." The room went quiet, except for the hiss of cooling metal. Renee's sighed. I just don't want this to turn into something worse. Softened his voice. I'm not looking for worse, I'm looking for peace, but some Adam's peace comes when people know they can't push you anymore the following week. Sherman stopped by again, asterisk. He leaned against the doorframe of the shop, watching sparks fly. You really think Winslow's gonna just let this slide, Sherman? Asked Curtis, shrugged. Winslow's opinion doesn't put food on my table, these is about me, not him. Sherman scratched his chin. It's bold. I'll give you that. Folks will either call you a genius or a fool, maybe both, Curtis replied, with a grin. The day of installation came in early June. Curtis dug a trench along the roadside's wheat, pouring down his back. In the heat, he mixed concrete in a wheelbarrow, poured it in stage sand, set the steel post deep into the earth. The smell of wet cement mixed with dust as he worked into the evening. The sky glowing orange by nightfall. The skeleton was buried and stable over the next few days. He disguised it carefully with cedar plank sanding and staining until it looked rustic and harmless to a passer-by. It was just another country mailbox bet. Curtis knew better when he stepped back to admire the finished product. Caleb whistled. Looks normal to meth. That's the point. Curtis said, looks ordinary, but it's not. Let's see them knock this one down. Neighbors noticed. Quickly, Edith Rowland strolled by, pausing to squint at it. New mailbox again? She asked, suspicion dripping in her tone. Curtis smiled politely. Yeah, let's hope this one lasts. She didn't press, but Curtis saw the curiosity in her eyes. Rumors would only grow now, but he didn't care. For the first time in months, he felt like he'd taken back control. That night, he sat on the porch with Renee, sipping sweet tea, staring at the sturdy post by the road. For once he didn't feel dread when headlights appeared in the distance. He almost wanted a patrol car to try. But Curtis wouldn't have to wait long, because the next time a patrol SUV came down that road, crash would send shockwaves through the whole neighborhood. The first impact came on a Thursday afternoon. Curtis had been in the barn oiling a saddle when the sound ripped through the air. Asterisk. The first impact came on a Thursday afternoon. Curtis had been in the barn oiling a saddle, the rich, familiar scent of leather and neatsfoot oil filling the air, when a sound ripped through the pastoral quiet, a sound entirely different from the sickening crunch of before. This was not a hollow crack or a brittle snap. This was a deep, resonant, metallic clang that echoed across the open land like a massive church bell being struck by a sledgehammer. It was a sound of immense force meeting immovable resistance. It was a sound of consequence. Curtis's hands stilled on the saddle. He didn't move for a full 10 seconds, listening to the echo die away, replaced by a new sound. The high, frantic whine of a damaged engine revving, then sputtering, then dying into a sudden, profound silence. He sat down. The oil rag? His movements were deliberate, calm, almost ritualistic. He walked out of the barn not with the frantic hurry of previous times, but with the steady pace of a man walking to confirm what he already knew. The scene at the end of his driveway was one of beautiful, catastrophic failure. The white HOA patrol SUV, a newer model Chevrolet Tahoe, was nosedived at a grotesque angle. Its front end was a concertinaed mess of shattered plastic, twisted chrome, and steaming radiator fluid. The airbags had deployed a white fungus blooming from the steering wheel and passenger side dash. The driver's side door was open, and a young man Curtis recognized as Tim, one of Winslow's nephews who'd gotten a summer security job, was stumbling out, clutching his nose, which was bleeding profusely from the airbag's impact. His eyes were wide with shock and dazed confusion. And the mailbox. The mailbox stood unscathed, unmarked. The sturdy cedar planks hadn't so much as a scratch. The post was perfectly vertical, a stoic sentinel amidst the chaos it had wrought. The only evidence of the impact was a smudge of white paint and a crumpled fragment of a headlight casing resting at its base. Curtis approached, his boots crunching on gravel and broken glass. "You all right, son?" he asked, his voice level, devoid of any triumph. Tim just stared at him, then back at the wreck of the SUV, then at the pristine mailbox. His brain, addled by the crash, couldn't process the contradiction. I hit it, he slurred, pointing a shaking finger at the box. I hit it straight on. How? Must have hit a pothole, Curtis said, echoing Winslow's favorite dismissal. Those roads are tight. It happens. The wail of sirens began to approach in the distance. Someone had already called it in. The first to arrive wasn't a sheriff's deputy, but Gregory Winslow himself. Pulling up in his pearl-white Lexus SUV, he erupted from the driver's seat, his face a thundercloud of fury. He took in the scene, his nephew bleeding, his organization's vehicle totaled, and Curtis Delaney standing there calm as you please, next to an indestructible mailbox. What in the hell did you do, Delaney? Winslow snarled, storming over. Ignoring his nephew completely. I didn't do a thing, Gregory. Curtis replied, his hands in his pockets. Your boy here seems to have a problem with my mailbox. Again, this is a trap. Winslow shouted, jabbing a finger at the steel-reinforced post. You booby-trapped county property. This is criminal. I'll have you arrested. Sheriff's deputies arrived then, 2 seasoned officers who knew the area and the people in it. They took statements. Tim thoroughly embarrassed and in pain. Admitted he'd clipped the mailbox, though the total destruction of the Tahoe's front end suggested a much more direct encounter. He was checked by paramedics and cited for reckless driving. Winslow was apoplectic, demanding Curtis be arrested for setting a dangerous trap. The senior deputy, a man named Miller with a weary expression, walked a slow circle around the mailbox. Mr. Winslow, Deputy Miller said finally, his voice dry. This mailbox is on Mr. Delaney's private property. It's set back from the road, within the county's right-of-way easement, but on his deeded land. It's a standard wooden design. As far as I can see, there's no sign of spikes, explosives, or any illegal modification. A man has a right to build a sturdy mailbox on his own land. Maybe if your drivers didn't keep hitting it, we wouldn't be having this conversation. He turned to Curtis. You planning on moving it, Curtis? No, sir, Curtis said. I like it right where it is. The battle lines once whispered in grocery stores and community meetings were now painted in the stark colors of a wrecked vehicle and a bleeding nose. The story spread through the community not like a prairie fire, but like a seismic shockwave. Winslow, humiliated and facing a massive insurance claim and the cost of a new vehicle for the HOA, did the only thing he could think to do. He escalated. The HOA's lawyers, a slick firm from Abilene, sent Curtis a formal letter. It cited an obscure clause in the HOA covenants about maintaining the pastoral and aesthetic harmony of the community and prohibiting structures deemed hazardous or eyesores. They demanded he dismantle his non-compliant intentionally hazardous mailbox within 72 hours or face daily fines and legal action. Curtis took the letter to his own lawyer, an old friend named Walter Briggs, who had a small practice mainly dealing with wills and property disputes. Walter read the letter, chuckled, and slid it back across his desk. They're bluffing, Curtis, Walter said. Aesthetic harmony, hazardous structure. That's lawyer talk for we're mad and we have deep pockets. They have no legal standing. A mailbox is a federally mandated receptacle. You could paint it neon pink and put it on a 10-foot pole if you wanted, as long as the mail carrier can reach it. Their driver was at fault, their vehicle is wrecked, and they're trying to bully you into paying for their mistake. Don't back down. Curtis didn't. The 72-hour deadline came and went. The HOA levied fines. Curtis refused to pay. The fight was no longer about a mailbox. It was about authority, and who truly had it. The community fractured openly. Sherman Hayes started a petition in support of Curtis, arguing that the HOA's patrols were overreaching and wasteful. He gathered dozens of signatures from longtime residents who were tired of Winslow's heavy-handed rule. Janice Hollowbrook, however, organized a counter-petition, framing Curtis as a dangerous provocateur who was costing everyone money and making the neighborhood a laughingstock. He's going to get someone killed with that thing. She argued at the next HOA meeting, which devolved into a shouting match so intense the sheriff's department had to be called again to keep the peace. The local news picked up the story Mailbox Mayhem in Abilene. HOA versus homeowner. The Battle of FM 89, and suddenly Curtis and his mailbox were minor celebrities. News crews filmed stand-ups in front of his ranch. Talk radio hosts debated the limits of property rights. Through it all, Curtis remained a stoic figure. He gave few interviews, mostly just stating the facts. His property had been damaged repeatedly, and he had taken steps to protect it. He didn't gloat. He didn't rage. His quiet resolve made him a sympathetic figure to many watching from the outside. Winslow, pressured by the bad publicity and the mounting legal fees from a case his own, lawyers privately told him was weak, made a fatal error. He decided to bypass the property dispute and attack Curtis personally. The HOA filed a civil lawsuit against Curtis Delaney, alleging intentional infliction of emotional distress on the driver, Tim, and seeking damages for the cost of the SUV, the medical bills, and the mental anguish suffered by the HOA board. The lawsuit was the match to the gasoline. Walter Briggs read the filing and his eyes lit up with the fire of a litigator who'd just been handed a golden opportunity. They've overplayed their hand. Curtis, Walter said, a grin spreading across his face. They've made it personal. Now we get our say in a courtroom. The case of Hidden Creek Homeowners Association v. Delaney was assigned to a no-nonsense district court judge named Evelyn Ortiz. The courtroom in Abilene was packed on the first day of the hearing. Neighbors, reporters, and curious onlookers filled the wooden benches. Curtis wore his one good suit, feeling the stiff fabric tighten across his shoulders. Renee sat beside him, her hand finding his and squeezing tightly. Winslow and his legal team sat at the other table, looking confident and expensive. The HOA's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Davidson, went first. He painted a picture of Curtis as a vengeful, calculating man who had set a deadly trap in a fit of pique over minor property damage. He called Tim to the stand, who, under coaching, tearfully described the terror of the impact, his ongoing nightmares, and his fear of driving. And this mailbox, Davidson said, holding up a photograph of the innocuous-looking cedar box. Does this look like a normal mailbox to you? No, sir. Tim sniffled. It looked normal, but it wasn't. It was like hitting a bank vault. Davidson then called Gregory Winslow, who testified about the pattern of hostility from Curtis, his refusal to be a team player, and the financial burden his actions had placed on the entire community. Then it was Walter Briggs's turn. He stood up slowly, adjusted his glasses, and approached the witness stand with the demeanor of a friendly grandfather. Mr. Winslow, Walter began, his voice soft. How many times has your patrol hit Mr. Delaney's mailbox? Winslow shifted uncomfortably. I believe 5 times.